Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. It's 2:30. I want to welcome all of you to our latest speaker series from Compassionate Koʻolaupoko. And today we have a special treat. Um, we have Aunty Puanani Burgess, and I'll be giving her a more formal introduction in just a second. But before we do that, I will just give you some background on Compassionate Koʻolaupoko. We're a collaborative initiative founded by partners representing the Castle, Kailua, and Kalaheo complexes of the Hawaii Department of Education, Windward Community College, and the Harold K.L. Castle Foundation. The Compassionate Koʻolaupoko Steering Committee began meeting during the fall of 2019 with a shared purpose of helping Koʻolaupoko become trauma-informed and better able to support youth and their families. Formed with the guidance from its advisory committee, Compassionate Koʻolaupoko's mission is to foster a culture of caring. In other words, we aim to cultivate a flourishing, thriving Koʻolaupoko where the youth and their families are resilient and compassionate so they can take care of themselves and others. We accomplish this by ensuring our school communities are trauma-informed and responsive. Um, Today's speaker series is one of several initiatives funded through generous support from the Noble Foundation, Education First, and the Rockefeller Foundation, and Nale Aloha Foundation, who also help in this effort. And I think today's featured speaker is perfect for accomplishing our mission. She's a Zen Buddhist priest, a poet, community mediator, and also a dragon feeder. She, to me, is a living treasure of Hawaii. Aunty Puanani Burgess is a student of Aunty Paki, and we'll share some of those teachings today as we strive to create a culture of caring here in Koʻolaupoko. And actually our name, Compassionate Koʻolaupoko, is inspired in part by her teachings. And so please join me in welcoming Aunty Puanani Burgess. Aunty Pua.
Oh, Derek, thank you so much. I'm really nervous. And I'm nervous because I care about the topic. I care about community. I care about all the people who are here with us. I think one of the first things I want to talk about is how does someone who's very shy do very public work? That's me. So most people don't know how really quiet I am, and that someone like me can still do work that makes you feel uncomfortable. And in fact, you have to be able to do it. I want to start with a story of who has been really a critical influence on my life. And the reason I want to tell you this story is that it's often not thought of well to talk about your spouse. But I have to tell you that the person who has been most influential in who I've become and how has been my husband. So we were married in 1968. And that means we have been married for more than 50 years right now. And a month or so after we were married, he told me, there's something I want to talk to you about. You know, when your partner starts off with that phrase, there's something I want to talk to you about, it's not going to be good. You know, you think, oh no, what's this going to be? And so what he said to me is, you better figure out what you're going to do with your life. And then you better go do them. Because your job is not my wife. I sat there and I looked at him and I said, what do you mean? I said, I'm going to do the work I'm meant to do. You better figure out what is the work you're meant to do. And then you better go figure out how to do it. Because you're not going to get your identity from being my wife. I was raised in a family that thought my future was to be wife and mother. And so right at the beginning, he's telling me, ano mo job. And I'm sitting there looking at him thinking, why didn't you tell me this before we got married? But here I am with that perplexity. What what am I going to do? The thing that I like so much about marrying this particular guy is that he came from Waianae. He was a Hawaiian boy who grew up in a family of working class people, hardworking, smart. Oh, hello. Hardworking, smart people, but not well educated in terms of formal education, but really smart and compassionate. So Hayden wanted to be a lawyer, and I watched him become that. And when I saw that he could, coming from a Hawaiian low to middle class family, if he could do it, then I could do it. From when I was in the 7th grade, that is what I wanted to be, is an attorney. And because I watched him do it, I thought, this I can do also. And he supported my being able to do that. When I think about, the topic that Derek and the partners have thought about, a compassionate Koʻolaupoko, it's a compassionate any community you come from. What can and how can your community become that? What are the points of principles and action that have to happen in order for you to become a compassionate community? And why is that important? Another word for compassionate is empathy. And I want to tell you 2 stories about empathy and the importance of it, and how what I hope we will experience today is you being able to see what other people see, and for you to be able to show them what you see. So I'm going to start with a poem about, not a poem, but a story about empathy. It's called the Poha and Popo principle. So where I live in Lualualei Valley, which is a very rural place, in a rural place of Waianae. So I live deep in the valley. And back here, there are lots of farms. People grow pigs. There are horses and cows that people have in their pastures. So it's still a very rural place back here. And our blocks back here are 2 miles around. And so when my middle child, his name is Poha Okalani, Kulanakila, Nana Ike Kumulipo, Yoshiyuki, Sonora, Burgess. When he was a little baby, his Chinese grandmother, his Popo, would push him around our block. And then she would stop at the pasture on the other side of the valley, and she would show him the horses and cows. And she would wait for Poha to laugh or point, because she thought little babies would love to see these big animals. But Poha did nothing except sit in his little stroller. And so Popo thought, this is odd. And nothing she did or said could get him to laugh or giggle or point or have any response whatsoever. So she decided to do it again the next day. So on the second day, she pushed him around the block, and she stopped at the pasture to show Poha the horses and cows. And she waited, and he did nothing again. Third day, Popo walked him around the block. And on that day, she decided, I'm not going to do this anymore if that's all that kid can do is just sit there. And then she became curious. She asked herself, I wonder what that kid is looking at. So she got down on her hands and knees, and she went to the eye plane of where Poha was looking at. And when she looked at what Poha was looking at, she understood that all he saw was tall grass. And Poha never saw one horse, not one cow. And so when she understood what he was looking at, he began to laugh. Now, being able to be empathetic, to be able to see what the other sees, is such an important part of building beloved community and building a compassionate community. The reason I focus, and I think these series of talks focuses on community, is that we're always trying to see how people are connected, especially if they're not connected, if they are isolated. That isolation and loneliness are deadly. And so as community builders, as community leaders, we have to be able to see where the connecting points are. Where do people meet up? Who in the community are really people who bring people together? What are those points of connectivity? The capacity for a community to diagnose and to speak about and to share those places of cohesion, of compassion, of being able to see each other is an important part of building any community. The reason I focused on Pono is it's very modern to have things be trauma informed. But think about, is it possible to build on trauma? I think not. I think people getting stuck in the ue vale no, in the sadness, in the places of brokenness, I don't think you can build a healthy, vibrant, resilient community based on that. I think what has to happen is that in our processes, in the way that we look at our community, we have to be aware of places where people connect. Who connects them? What places connect them? And to be able to make those places and people and processes become part of an important way that the community moves forward in building a hopeful community. I want to tell you the story of, and in one of the earlier talks, Pono Shim talked about aloha that Aunty Puanani taught. She also taught Pono. And the way she talked about Pono, and which is why I offered the title of this talk is Koʻolaupoko Pono'i. So when Aunty Puanani talks about Pono, she talks about the 3 layers. On the first layer of Pono, the meaning is to come and to do things with good intentions, with right frame of mind. You intend to do good, you intend to benefit, you intend to heal. That is the first layer of Pono. When you begin to do things with a Pono framework, the next layer down, Pono means to create and to experience balance, to experience equality, and to be able to experience fairness. The ability to do those 2 things leads to the very deepest definition of Pono, which is hope. And so today is a way of helping you think about where hope lies for you as a person, for you as a member of your family, for your community. Where are the places of hope? And how do we acknowledge those places, those people, those processes that are bringing hope and uncovering hope And then how do we build a community based on the hope? When we talk about trauma, the tendency is what happens is we begin to talk about the bitterness, and hopefully with the idea of healing that. But that process takes a long time. And my fear is always that we get stuck in the ue valeno, in the sorrow. And once we get stuck in that place, it's hard to pull your feet out of that place and to begin seeing the hope. I think, one of the most important lessons that I have learned, and it's another story about how hope and being able to be compassionate with each other can lead to incredibly important healing spaces. When I was in my second year of law school at Richardson School of Law, I was an intern at Legal Aid Society, and I was assigned to Cynthia Thielen. And Cynthia at that time was the attorney for the Protect Kahoolawe Ohana. And so she assigned me to them. And I was a second year law student. And, I grew up hearing about the work that the Ohana was doing in stopping the bombing of Kahoolawe, and in being able to bring into focus the kind of resilience that we needed to have. The fact that we had to have certain practices stop in order for the land to heal and the people to heal. As part of my work with the PKO during my second year, I had become part of their negotiating team. And one of the things that I helped them negotiate was the building of the first halal on Kahoolawe. Now, the Ohana thought, if we build this halal, this traditional structure on Kahoolawe, we'll be telling the Navy that we are back, we have returned. And this halal will stand for that return, and that we have a place and we belong on this island. And during that time, Uncle Harry Mitchell was still alive. Uncle Charlie Keao was still alive. Uncle Les Kuloloyo was becoming a kupuna. And there were many young Hawaiian men like Skippy Iowane and Palikapu Deadman, Keone Fairbanks, and many others who were part of the Ohana during that time. And all of these people came to Kahoolawe to build the traditional structure. And we brought the traditional materials that came from different islands, and we brought them all to Kahoolawe. While we were building the halal, sometimes the enlisted personnel, the Navy guys, would be watching off to the side. And they would come up to us and they would ask if they could come and help us. And in a very Hawaiian way, we didn't tell them yes, and we didn't tell them no. But they understood that they were not being invited to come and help build the halal. And so when we went home after that, that month's visit to Kahoolawe, when we came back the next month, what we saw standing in a pile next to the halal that we were building was a pile of pohaku, a pile of stone, the same kind of stone we were using to build the foundation of the halal. And what those Navy guys did while we were away, they went around the island to find the stone just like the ones we were using to build the halal. And they went and found those stones and they brought them back and they just laid them in a pile next to the halal. And when they did that, they didn't come up to us and they didn't come to ask for gratitude or recognition for what they did. They just stood off to the side. And then when we looked at the stone and we began to understand what they were saying to us, we understood the compassion and the interest that they were expressing about the important work that we were doing, and they were honoring that work. They know that they weren't invited to participate, and so they figured out a way to do something that could demonstrate their honoring of what we were doing and that they understood how important this was to us. And then we began to invite them to hapai pohaku, to carry the stone and help lay the stone in the halal. That moment of fierce civility, a friend of mine teaches that process of being fiercely civil to each other, of honoring and holding in respect and in compassion people who are different from each other, who are so far away from agreement. In that moment of fierce civility, we built compassion and we built a way for the Navy and the Hawaiian people to find a way to meet in the middle. The capacity for a community, while it's going through growing pains, the ability for us to see what the other sees and find the places of compromise. And compromise isn't about winning or losing. Compromise means with promises. It means that each side promises something that they will bring to the center, and the other promises other things. It is an exchange of value, an exchange of values that becomes very important. So the idea of compassion and how you build compassion within a community, within a family, is so important to its success. So because we were able to find middle ground during the building of the halal, what began to happen was, up until that point, when we were negotiating with the Navy, we negotiated with the captain. The captain was the one who managed the island itself and what the Navy was willing or not willing to do on the island. But once that process of coming to the middle happened, I'm not certain, but I think that process, that action went up the chain of command, and that story of what was happening on the island went up to the admiral, and we began to negotiate at the level of the admiral. And when we were able to negotiate at that level, we were able to negotiate bringing our children onto the island. Now, at that point, just civilians coming onto the island was a big step for the Navy to take. They were always worried about liability issues. And so their willingness to negotiate for us to bring our keiki onto the island. Now, my daughter was 8 years old when she first went to Kahoolawe, and she was one of the first children that went. What the Ohana understood was, we're not going to be there forever. We had to pass on the kuleana to the other generation, to the generation that follows us. And so it was important for our children to be able to be a part of the building process and building relationship with the Navy, so that when we passed, when we retired, there would be others to take our place. So we were able to negotiate more and more things. And we were able to negotiate things that did not require us to go to court. Going to court was useful and important, but being able to pick up a phone and being able to say, can we talk to you about this? And then being invited to sit and talk with the people who could make decisions about what went on the island was a blessing. And that came because of the compassion that each side showed to each other. What I want to emphasize in that story about Kahoolawe is that the building of the Halal, it was not negotiated. We did not talk about what putting stones in the foundation meant. We didn't talk about any of it. We just did the work. And it was such a typical Hawaiian way of approaching things. We just did the work together. And when doing that work, the healing came. And there weren't apologies given. There weren't winning and losing. There was cooperation and coordination. I think all of those are part of what makes a compassionate community. In this first session, I'd like to do a breakout session. And I'm going to read to you, a poem and tell you why it's so important. The fact that I'm a poet has been one of the major methods that I have been able to become who I am, is because I can deal with truth and painful truth in a way that enlightens me and brings awareness and insight to others. This poem I wrote many years ago is called Choosing My Name. When I was born, my mother gave me 3 names: Christabel, Yoshie, and Puanani. Christabel was my English name, my Social Security card name, my school name, the name I gave when teachers asked me for my real name. It was a safe name. Yoshie was my home name, my everyday name, the name that reminded my father's family that I was Japanese, even though my nose, hips, and feet were wide. It was the name that made me acceptable to them, who called my Hawaiian mother Kuroi Mame, black bean. It was a saving name. Puanani is my chosen name, my Piko name, connecting me to the Aina and to the Kai and to the Po'ekahiko. It is my blessing and my burden, my amulet, my spear. When I wrote this poem, it was first published in the Honolulu Star Bulletin. And my father's family read this poem, and it was published widely. And they were starting to call my father and ask me, how could he let me write this, and how could he let me publish this that showed the kind of bias that my Japanese family had toward my mother. My father, to his honor, told them, this is her life. This is her experience. She has a right to it. Leave her alone. I thought, this poem has traveled wide and has showed people why knowing the story of your name and how you connect to it. Your name is how you connect to your ancestors. It's how you connect to the deepest part of who you are and who you're becoming. So when we go into our small group, I want you to think about your names, and I want you to tell the story of your names. We're going to be going into small groups of 3. And in those small groups, each of you will take at least 7 minutes you will have in total to tell 3 stories. First, to tell the story of all of your names and what they mean to you. To tell the story of your community and what that means to you. And third, I want you to tell the story of your gift. Before we break into those small groups, I want to tell you the story of the boy with the gift. And many of you have heard me tell this story, and others have told it as well. But I cannot tell you how grateful I am to that boy who trusted me finally to tell me the story of his gift. When I first asked the question, and it comes in a process called Guts on the Table, in which we tell 3 stories, your name, your community, and your gift. In the first time that I met him, he was in the 11th grade at Waianae High School. He refused to tell the story of his gift. And when it was his turn, he really pushed back hard against me. He said, what, miss? What kind of gift think I get? I stay in this freaking special ed class. I get a hard time read. I get a hard time do that math stuff. And why you make me shameful asking me that kind of question? What's your gift? If I had gift, you think I'd be in this class? So he just shut up. And when you feel shame and you shut up, that's what happened to me. And I just put all my stuff away and I took off. I never apologized, never tried to make better. I just left because I felt so shame. I made him shame. But what is important is that, and this is what you have to pay attention to. In every community, there are places where you're going to see plenty people you like see. And you're going to see plenty people you don't like see either. So in Waianae, Tamura's store is one of those places. So I'm in Tamura's store and I'm pushing the cart down the aisle. And I see that boy in an aisle and his back is faced toward me. And I'm telling you, I was so scared. I started to run backwards and trying to pull the cart and trying not to hit anything and trying not to call attention to the fact that I was there. I did not want him to turn around and I didn't want him to yell at me again. So I kept on backing up, and then he turned around and he looked at me with his big, beautiful face. And he threw his arms open and he said, Auntie. And my heart dropped because I went from Miss to Auntie. I said, Auntie, I've been thinking about you, I've been thinking what my gift. that Auntie told me I'd get on gifts, so I better find them, So Auntie, I've been thinking, what my gift? So I looked at him and I asked him, so brother, what is your gift? He said, I had a hard time reading and that math stuff hard for me, But Auntie, when I go in the ocean, I can call the fish, And the fish, he come every time. Every time I can put food on my family table. Every time. And sometimes when I stay in the water, the shark, he come, and he look at me. And I look at him and I tell him, Uncle, I'm not going to take plenty fish. I'm going to take 1, 2, just for my family. All the rest, I leave for you. So the shark, he tell me, are you cool, brother? And I tell the shark, hey, Uncle, you cool. So the shark, he go his way, Auntie. I go my way. I think that's my gift. I tell you, my friends, I have never experienced such wisdom in someone so young. And so from him, I started to ask teachers and administrators and the superintendent of education and the CASs. I began to ask, are we identifying the gifts of our children and are we teaching to them, to those gifts? The gift like that, what that boy has, doesn't ripen by itself. It needs space to live and to grow and to be appreciated. That boy will never go to college by his own choice. I saw him in Long's, a year or so ago, and I asked him if he would like to come with me to UH West Oahu. And he knew instantly what I was trying to do. I was trying to influence him to go to college. And he looked at me and he said, Auntie, college not for me, maybe for my baby. And, I started to try to persuade him. And he said, Auntie, I don't ask you come on my boat, help me fish, right? No, ask me go on top of your boat, help you fish, because I'm not going to do it. I saw a man who figured out a way of dignity and self-sufficiency and pride that is very, very different from a lot of what we focus on in schools. We focus on school as the outcome. It is part of a growth process, but it is not for everyone. I think that is my point. It is not for everyone. And for those for whom that is not their way of becoming, are we serving them well as well? Are we trying to find the gifts of our children? And are we honoring them? And are we teaching to them and supporting them really flourishing in those gifts? It's a gift that I want to give to you, being able to think about that as you shape and form and design your way of being, your way of teaching, your way of being taught. So I'm going to ask Josh Levinson, who is one of the most incredibly gifted facilitators, to help us get into small groups of 3. Now, the problem with going into small groups is that it takes 1,000,000 years for someone to go first. I don't want you to waste all of your time waiting to figure out who's going first. Somebody go. Somebody start. Tell your 3 stories. Tell the story of your names, the story of your community, and the story of your gift. So we're going to break into 3 minutes, three people groups for 15 minutes. Is it 15 minutes, Josh? 15 to 20
25 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And as what often happens in situations like this, the number goes up and down. So I keep changing how many breakout rooms we're going to have to make the numbers work out. But once we create the rooms, if you have 4 people, then that's okay. If you have 2 people, then that's okay. Just jump in, and the time will go really fast. So give me one moment and Derek put in the chat the instructions.
Any pressing questions that anyone would like to make or comment?
Hi, I have a question or comment kind of too. I didn't really understand when you said community, because I've tended to move around a lot and I didn't have like a set. Was it like a geographic community or was it people, like a certain group of people? I didn't know how to really answer that.
Let me just say yes. Whatever community means to you, say what that is. It may be family, it may be a geographic designation. Whenever you say community, what comes to your mind? Describe what that is. Depending on who you are and where you grew up, it will differ. So in Hawaii, a lot of it tends to be place-based, geographic. But you know, a family is a community. The street that you live on can be a community. Whatever you define as community, describe that. The importance of that question, especially when you're working with young people, is trying to see how they define being part of something, where they belong. And it's how they define what that community is part of the diagnostic. So without you telling them, it means the neighborhood, the streets that you live on, how do they define community? And how are they attached and how do they belong? So I try not to define that word for people, but have them self-identify what community means to you and then describe that. Does that explain that? So the answer is yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. You know, the tricky thing about that is my temptation is always to define things, and that brings clarity. But sometimes, you know, it's in the non-clarity that a lot of the discovery takes place. And as a facilitator, you're always trying to make not necessarily a place of comfortableness, but you're making a space where people can try out an idea or try out a way of thinking, that they can have a courageous space to do it. And part of the courage is to define. And so I usually like to leave definitions for others and to hear how you define those things. You know, by the time I was, by the time I was 18, I lived in 10 different places in Hawaii. And And it was because my family was not very stable place-wise. So my community was my family. The mother, father, my sister, and I. And then whoever we live close to, that was my community. So it wasn't until I landed in Waianae and married into this community, and then my children became part of this community also, did I ever have the ability to define a geographic place as my community, as Waianae. So that didn't come until very late in my life. And you know, this year I'm going to be 74 years old. And so the fact that community has changed its meaning over time is important. For me, a lot of my community has been the one that I've designed and developed, because I have been part of a lot of different organizations. And part of my work has been to make organizations. So because I went to law school, I helped develop Ka'alafar, Ho'aina Omakaha, the Community Mental Health Center, Time Out Nursery, other organizations on other islands, Hackbed, maybe a dozen or more organizations I helped form and create community around. It was because I didn't have community for so much of my early part of my life that I've been driven by being able to form community with people. So, you know, when you meet my relatives, and I'm going to say it the only way I know how, I'm pretty famous in terms of Hawaii, but they don't understand who I am. So both my Japanese and my Hawaiian family have absolutely no idea who I am. And they don't understand anything about how I've become. And they don't want to know. They just accept that I'm everywhere. And so, you know, sometimes you just have to accept the things that come your way and find the blessing out of it. But you know, my idea of a great day is to be in my front yard, sitting under the mango tree, just talking to the mango tree, and that's a great day. But I'm constantly with people doing this kind of work. It's a blessing and a burden. So I want to tell you a couple more principles. One is called the Pearl City High School principle. And it's about the role of history and why teaching the deep history of Hawaii is important. This story comes from a woman who taught Hawaiian history at Pearl City High School. She's a Japanese woman who taught this history. And what she told me was she'd come to the part in Hawaii's history that dealt with the Great Mahele. And the Mahele was a time where Aina became property. Now you think about that transformation where Aina, which is something living, breathing, that feeds you, that is nourishing to you, when Aina becomes property. And property can be sold and property can be owned. That idea was a strange idea for the Hawaiian people. And when that happened, that revolution was not well understood during the time that it was happening. So a lot of that happened during the time of the Mahele, the great transformation of land into property that could be bought and sold and owned. And what this woman said was every time she came to the great Mahele in the teaching of the history of Hawaii, she would watch a lot of the Hawaiian kids really just zone right out of that conversation. They didn't want to hear anything about the Mahele and what happened and how land got taken away from Hawaiian people. That's the common way of thinking about what happened in the Mahele. Land got taken away from the Hawaiian people. And so she couldn't help the students understand that, and what she was hearing from her students was the reason why land got taken away from the Hawaiians were because the Hawaiians were stupid and lazy. Because if they weren't stupid and lazy, they would still have their land. So what she tried to explain to them is that it wasn't that at all. It was purposeful. The way land was being handled was really a transformation of what land was thought of before. And it wasn't stupidity, and it wasn't because they were lazy and weren't paying attention. They were being asked to do things that made no sense to them. How do I now go and register to own my mother? What is that? And she tried to explain to them what the history really was and what was actually being thought of among the common people. And she could not help her students understand that it wasn't a failing of their ancestors, but it was purposeful oppression and colonization that was happening. So one day at the beginning of school, she thought she would try something. So, on the big whiteboard that you have in the classroom, she wrote up way at the top of the board, she wrote, "Students, exclamation point, register to own your chairs in 2 weeks or lose them." And then she signed her name, and then she put one of those blocks around that sign. And then she didn't say anything about it. She just left that sign up on the blackboard, on the whiteboard. And so kids would come in and every day, and then they'd look on the board and they read her sign, and they didn't register to own their chairs. So 2 weeks later, when they came into her classroom, there were no chairs in the classroom. And so they asked her, "So teach, like, where are chairs?" And she said, "Excuse me, you read English?" "Yeah." "Okay, let's read this sign. Students, register to own your chair in 2 weeks or lose them. I sign my name, put the official block around it. Why didn't you do what I told you to do?" And they looked at her, they said, "What? You never tell us, pay attention. This is real. Nobody ever did that to us before. So we just blew it off. We thought, this is not real." She said, "Now do you know what happened to your ancestors? In a language that wasn't theirs, they were being asked to do something that made no sense to them. And nobody was having empowerment workshops. No one was collecting groups of Hawaiian people and saying, this Mahele thing, this is for real. You better do something about it. You got to do this, this, and this. And this is how you get your land." Nobody was doing that. So at that point, her students began to understand why it's important to learn the history. It's important not to close your eyes or your mind or your ears to that history. You have to learn it. You have to make sense of it. You have to make sure it doesn't continue. That kind of thievery does not continue in your lifetime. So, you know, how teachers really figure out interesting ways, clever ways, trickster ways of teaching. That has to be something you think about. How do you bypass, like around vaccination, how do you bypass people's fears or misunderstandings or non-understandings? How do you puka through that and get them to think about things that are uncomfortable? How do you do that? So the role of teachers and the role of facilitators are really important, and teachers thinking of themselves as facilitators. You're facilitating a process, facilitating the acquisition and the acceptance and the understanding of different ways of seeing things. Is so important to how we make beloved, compassionate, Pono-informed care and Pono-informed communities. You know, when you think about the phrase, the Hawaiian state motto, o Mauke'ea o Ka'aina I ka Pono, normally it's translated, the life of this land is perpetuated in righteousness. If you translated it and make it say, the life of this land, Hawaii, is perpetuated in hope. That gives a different way of thinking about how you get people to acknowledge and build a hopeful community. You know, when you're helping people discover where their strength lies, they have to bring something to the table. They cannot just bring the pain and suffering. You cannot build a life on that. They cannot get stuck in the ue valeno. You have to help them recognize the hopefulness that they have inside of them and that they are experiencing. I want to read to you a poem called I Come From a Place. And then when we break up into small groups, I want you to write your poem of I Come From a Place. This poem was written by Ho'ipo di Canberra. You know, in my community, when I was in my 20s and 30s, there were a group of us who were in their 20s and 30s, and we were friends. We're still friends, and we still work together. So those friends are Eric Enos, Gigi Kokio, Ho'ipo di Canberra, Dixie Padello, my husband Hayden, myself. We all were young people then. Now we're old people, and we're still working together, and we still inform and teach each other. This poem was written by Ho'ipo as a way of celebrating where we all come from. I come from a place where pale golden fields and sharp mountains surround a halal crying to be recreated for Poe Hawaii. I come from a place where Menehune trails are silhouetted against the horizon's colors of blue, green, and silvery gray. I come from a place where black lava rocks melted together over time embrace the coastline. White ehu-colored limu cling to the deepest recess, close to the ocean's bottom. I come from a place where people love old cars. They like fixing them and making them well. And the challenge of getting to town and back just one more time. I come from a place where people are satisfied with the bare minimum income and living conditions. I come from a place where Puanani dreams mouse poems and a kukui nut mirrors her beauty. And Diane remembers seeing Lono calling the rain. And Robbie is willing to say Kaneaki Heiau is our sacred site. I come from a place where Dr. Fred Dodge dreams and works for Makua to be given back to the Poʻe Hawaii. And Isabel swims in front of rest camp and dreams of a soon to be the greatest marine science school for our kids. I come from a place where it is dark and Kamaka teaches us about the light in the heavens and dolphins dance on water for your birthday. April 1986. You know, teaching children that they are poets and making a space for them to be poets and creating a safe space to express all kinds of different ideas in poetry or some form of art is so important to the well-being and the making of compassionate and empathetic communities. What I want you to be able to experience is what it feels like to write your poem about where you come from and the things that are elements that you think of and that you are hoping to pass on to your students, to your children, to your neighbors. I think the final story before we go into taking a few minutes. Oh my gosh, Josh, it's 5 minutes past 4.
Only 1 minute past 4. We'll pretend it's 4.
Okay, let's pretend it's 4. What I want you to do is go back into your small group and take 5 minutes to write a poem about where you come from and then read it to your partners in community. Okay, go back into your small groups, the same ones. Take a few minutes to write at least 5 lines of a poem about your community or the place that you come from, and then read it to each other. And then we'll come back and close up. Okay?
Aunty Pua, I'm gonna ask for forgiveness, and it's gonna be slightly different groups.
Okay.
Yep. Just because of it's a slightly different constellation of people who are still with us, and there were some technical difficulties the first time around. So it's gonna
Let's
be
do magic.
I'm gonna do magic. Okay, give me 1 second. So it's gonna be 15 minutes in your groups. Okay, so give me 1.
Well, that was interesting. Any questions or comments before I turn the mic back to Josh and Derek? I really appreciate the poem. Well, you know what I wanted to just say about that process is the poem that I sent you by Wendell Berry called How to Be a Poet. What that is about is having another narrative running in somebody's head, especially if you're dealing with people who are traumatized. So what I usually do is I ask people to say, I am a poet, and to have that narrative running instead of, I am a failure. I am not worthy. All those other trauma-loaded words. Say, I am a poet. And then I give them a choice of several poems, and I ask them to read poems. And if there is a poem that resonates with you, look for a line in that poem that really speaks for you. And then take that line and use it as the first line of your poem, like I come from a place, and then write a poem afterward. So what you have there is you have said the words, I am a poet. Then you wrote a poem. Then you read your poem. Then you say again, I am a poet. And then you do it again. So you're giving people an opportunity to live and to experience a different view of themselves and making it physical. It's usually the first line that's the toughest. So if you give them something that they really resonate with and they can choose their first line out of it, then that opens the door for the poem to come. And then they just follow it. But it comes with taking on and thinking about themselves as a poet, as opposed to ignorant or a failure. So I just wanted to give you that closing way of thinking about this exercise and why it's important. And I wanted you to experience it before you used it, so that you know what the impact is on your life before you ask anybody else to do it. Okay, now I'm going to give it back to Derek with my thanks to both Derek and Josh for such wonderful facilitation.
Mahalo, Aunty Pua. We want to just mahalo nui loa you for all of your mana'o that you share with us, the ike, about, especially about hope, you know, and how, and you know, it just blew my mind when you talked about our state model, you know, ua mau ke ea o ka ina i Pono, you know, instead of thinking about the land being perpetuated in righteousness, the land being perpetuated in hope, and going back to how we can't just be about the trauma, but it's really about the resiliency, and that's built upon that layer of hope. And so thank you for your messages today. We really appreciate you and your wisdom. And we also want to thank everyone for joining us today and
Yeah.
and spending this time with us and being able to connect, you know, albeit virtually, but we really appreciate you being here. Just want to share that we do have a website. I'm going to share my screen right now. We do have a website, and we also have a YouTube channel. So that's our YouTube channel, and you can see our past speaker series. The only one that I haven't uploaded yet, and it's on my things to do, and that is for our first speaker series with Gawan Higa. But you can see the one about from Pono Shim that Aunty Pua mentioned, as well as our other speakers as well, which will be featured here. And Aunty Pua's talk will also be featured here. We created a playlist, by the way, of Gawan Higa's trauma-informed videos. There's about 4 in that series, and so I would encourage you to check that out as well. And then if you go to our website, you can actually contact us, and actually it goes to Josh, or you can sign up to receive notifications when our speaker series occur, or trainings that we provide, as well as other events that are going on. And then you can also link directly to our YouTube channel, our Instagram account, as well as Twitter. So
Wow.
again, thank you so much for coming out today. We really appreciate it and spending this time. Josh, do you want to say any words before we go?
No, thanks, Derek. Just thanks to everybody for joining in. And there will be more. And so hopefully you'll receive our emails. But thank you so much. And thanks, Aunty Pua. We love the time we spend with you.
Aloha.
Aloha, everyone.